Welcome to everyone on this call. It's great to have a number of people on our first webinar for the Task Force Level Playing Field paper. Can someone who's external to the Electricity Authority please just give me a thumbs up to show that you can hear? Brilliant, thank you. So the purpose of this is very much to answer your questions. We've put out a proposal for 8 weeks of consultation, and we're very keen to engage with people during that 8 weeks, as opposed to just receiving written submissions at the end of it or something similar. So my name is Rob Burno, for those who haven't met me. I am the program lead for the Energy Competition Task Force and was also heavily involved in the authoring of the Level Playing Field paper. So we'll be a first port of call for answering your questions today. We've also got Matt Bailey with us from the Commission, who's also been heavily involved in the paper. So between Matt and I, we are your primary question answerers. I just want to acknowledge we also have Nathan Strong from the Commission on this call. He's a commissioner and one of the members of the task force. It's really great to have him here to hear any initial feedback we get, hear the questions, and make sure that at a task force member level, they really understand what stakeholders are saying to us. So we will continue with engagements during this process to ensure that we have task force members available as well as the staff who were involved in authoring the paper. Can I have the next slide, please, Lisa? So we'll start this with a karakia and then move into the session proper. Kia tau ngā manakitanga a te mea naro, ki runga, ki tēnā o tātou, kia mahia, te huia mā kihi, kia toi te kupu, toi te mana, toi te aroha, toi te reo Māori. Oh, I think you went slightly too quick there, Lisa. Well, welcome everyone. As I said, it's great to have you here. We are very keen to hear your views. Just some housekeeping. We are recording this session. We think that's important, and we will be putting that on our website so anyone who wasn't able to attend gets the same access to the same information. If we're not able to get through all your questions today, we will make sure that we do respond to them in writing. We have a Q&A part on our website, and we're continually updating that, including for any written questions we receive during the 8-week feedback process. I intend to talk for probably less than 10 minutes at the beginning of this, just to give you a little bit of an overview of the paper, make sure everyone's on the same page, but most of this will be Q&A. You're welcome to raise your hands, you're welcome to put a question in the chat or in the Q&A, whatever suits you best. We will get to as much of the questions as we can, and if there is a need to, if there's a lot of questions and we can't get to them, we're happy to be as flexible as possible in terms of running more of these sessions or doing whatever is most useful to engage with you as a group. Next slide, please, Lisa. So I'm briefly just going to cite this work and make sure that we are all on the same page as to where it's come from and what's sort of built up into the proposal that we've now put out. So the Energy Competition Task Force was created in August last year and has suggested 8 initiatives to strengthen the electricity market's performance. You'll all be aware of the context of August last year when there were very high wholesale prices, driven mostly by shortages of fuel, but it was pause for thought for all of us in terms of what can we be doing to make sure that the market is delivering as best possible, that it is delivering on competition, which we all know competition over time puts downward pressure on prices, and is also giving as many options as possible for consumers, big and small, to manage their electricity use and ultimately manage their cost. So we came up with 8 initiatives. They are not intended to do everything, but they were the initiatives that we thought either were new and worth putting in place quickly, or were already in flight, but we thought we could speed up and really make sure we got them in place as quickly as possible. Next slide, please. one of the initiatives, the Level Playing Field Measures Initiative, which also seems to go by the name 1D, because we put numbers and letters next to them, was that we would look at the pros and cons of various different measures that could address concerns about the control of the flexible generation base by the gentailers. They are the ones who own most of the key flexibility kit at this point in time, be that thermal generation or hydro generation, and acknowledging that not only did they have control of that and how it goes into the market, but that also they're vertically integrated. So the very parties they may be supplying with essentially access to that flexible generation through hedges are also their competitors in another part of the market. We worked on that through the latter part of last year, and in the intervening time we also published our preliminary findings from the risk management review, which had also been looking particularly at access to hedges backed by that flexible generation, so was very, very closely related to the Package 1 work in the Energy Competition Task Force. As we worked through the various different level playing field options, ranging from kind of accounting type disclosure options all the way to thinking about separation, many of which had been suggested to us by participants in the market. We also asked ourselves that question in the context of the risk management review findings. What at this point in time of those level playing field measures would be most suited to the competition risks that we are seeing in the New Zealand market, and are we already at a point where we consider that those measures should be introduced as opposed to they sit there as a backstop, noting they were initially conceived as a backstop in August. That was, I think, the language that we used. What this led to is a proposal that we released now 2 weeks ago, where the task force and the authority have come to a view that of the various different measures that were put in front of us as options, knowing that we looked at other sectors and other jurisdictions as well, we consider the non-discrimination obligations are the ones that best match the competition risks that we have seen in the New Zealand market, and our proposal at this point in time to level the playing field between the 4 large gentailers and other participants in the market is that non-discrimination obligations should be brought in as soon as possible. We've proposed a progressive approach, starting from options that we can implement at speed to options that are inevitably move deeper and are harder to implement, but also potentially have a substantially more significant effect. And we've set them out in the proposal as steps 1, step 2, and step 3. And we would, if we progress with this proposal, looking to be pretty clear with all stakeholders as to what the implementation path is, so people understand what the triggers would look like, understand what would cause us to move between options. Next slide, please, Lisa. So these are the 3 options. They're all well set out and traversed in the paper. You may well have a number of questions about them, which I'm very happy for us to address, but I'm not going to look to address them in detail at this point in time, assuming that you've had a good chance to read them. But effectively what you'll see through steps 1, steps 2, and step 3 is that the level of intervention, the level of control put into the market increases. So in step 1, it's principles based, and it does leave opportunity for the gentailers to implement the principles in a way that best works for their business, knowing that we are steadfast in terms of the principles still matter and compliance needs to be demonstrated with them. So it's not a sense that the principles still wouldn't be strong, it's just that they are potentially able to be implemented in a way that allows the gentailers to think of their particular business arrangements. Step 2 essentially tightens those non-discrimination requirements into something that will be more prescribed. Step 3 says if we are still concerned about discrimination issues occurring in relation to hedges, there is an alternative of essentially requiring that all gentailer supplied hedges are traded through quite a strictly regulated marketplace that would effectively ensure that everyone has exactly the same access to the same kind of products for the same price. We have also talked in the paper about virtual disaggregation, which was another of the initiatives that was put forward by the task force that has a direct line of sight back to the Market Development Advisory Group's paper in December 2023, where they had recommended this. MDAG's recommendation was quite tight. It was looking at a very particular issue in terms of control of particular pieces of flexible generation kit that they thought in time may lead to some kind of market power type concern. We've thought about that narrowly, and we've thought about virtual disaggregation widely. We've got some views in the paper, and we're really keen to hear people's feedback on that. Very open to different views as to how that might be a useful remedy, acknowledging that it is quite powerful. Next slide, please, Lisa. So this is kind of the rationale in a nutshell. Again, it is set out in the paper, but our current view is that this proposed progressive approach is the most appropriate response to the level of risk we've seen in the market, that it's the best balanced solution, that it allows us to put in place a proposal that should make a difference pretty quickly. It gives us escalation options if we're still seeing concerns. It acknowledges that there are risks in direct market intervention, the classic phrase constantly used of unintended consequences, of various different things that could cause either an implementation or in the longer play of the regulation to have a negative impact. By way of example on that, we're all very clear that the base of flexibility in the New Zealand electricity market needs further investment and needs to be expanded, and any intervention that ended up cutting across the investment incentives for expanding that flexibility base would be unhelpful. So we need to manage the wider environment to ensure that we are achieving the overall outcomes that the authority and we believe the sector is aiming at in terms of hedges, which is more liquidity, competitive prices, and even-handedness. We're also comfortable with the logic that if you do something that achieves better outcomes for hedges, that then flows through to more competition on both the retail and the generation side, and that more competition equals more choices for consumers, equals downwards pressure on prices. And I think I have had a few debates with people on that. I think that's a matter of kind of really well understood market dynamics, but we are open to a discussion on any elements of this proposal. That was as much as I was intending to say in the opening. I'm conscious that we've already, I've taken up my 10 minutes. We are open to your questions from now.
Rob, you have a question from Joshua. Some may view the fact that 3 steps have been thought through and have been proposed suggest the authority is almost certainly going to implement something similar to the first one or 2 steps. Can you give us any steer of any internal EA sentiment on that?
Sure. Hey, thanks, Joshua. Good question. Look, we thought it was really important to come out with a concrete proposal that was well enough developed that allowed people to really see what it might look like and give us feedback on. So that's the rationale of, for example, having Appendix B to the paper, which sets out some draft non-discrimination principles, noting that we've been clear in the note at the top of those principles that they are not a settled authority position that we are consulting on as a code change. They're meant to help people's submissions. We do absolutely, as the paper said, think that this proposal is a good idea, is positive, and will achieve the competition and efficiency objectives that are in the authority's statutory purpose. But I can absolutely assure you from internal conversations I've had at the authority, including at the board level, that we are very, very open to feedback, and that part of the reason for having this webinar, for a bunch of other events we'll be having during this 8 weeks, is to make sure that the proposals have been really, really well road tested. What I would say we're steadfast on is, at this point in time, we have seen competition risks, and we are steadfast in responding to those risks, and we are steadfast in our view that we are seeking to achieve liquidity, competitive prices, and even-handedness in relation to hedges. How we get to that, and whether there's a different or a better way, or whether there should be tweaks to these proposals, very, very open to that, and really, really keen to hear feedback.
Rob, we have a question from Rob Allen. The EA details that retail competition has stalled since at least 2020, 2021. How long from now should it take for retail competition to get to the point where it's working properly? And how will we know when we get there?
That's a really difficult question to give a concrete answer to. So I'm going to try and answer it, and then Rob, come back if you want to push me further on the answer. Because it's a fair point. How will we know the outcomes? And to some extent, we will obviously pay close attention to the inputs. We are looking very closely at what we're actually seeing in relation to hedges, to offers, to trades, to prices, and they will give us an indication as to whether that input is working in a way that we expect it to, knowing the risks that we uncovered in the risk management review. But then in terms of the so what outcomes are we getting? I mean, look, there's lots of crude measures you can give of competition, in terms of market share and things like that, and they are all interesting indicators. But part of what we are committed to doing is keeping the monitoring really, really close on the sector and on retail competition. We've benefited greatly from the conversations we've had with all people involved in the retail sector, both those who have been concerned about competition and those who say it's working better than others would have us believe. And those are some of the indicators then allow us to investigate and allow us to test, is this actually working or not? What are the potential blockers and barriers? So part of it will be absolutely needing to be close to the sector and seeing what is actually happening and what are people experiencing. The other thing we kind of thought about is the proposition that's been put to us is that by hedging not being available, the growth of new entrants who are currently sort of smaller than the incumbents has been retarded, and their ability to offer innovative products has been held back. We would be really looking, assuming we're going to put in place some form of measures in response to level playing field concerns, and also that we continue down the path of the standardized flexibility product, which is very, very closely related to this level playing field issue. If those continue to go, and if we ultimately put something in place, we would expect pretty soon after that would give a good degree of certainty both for retailers who've been concerned about access to hedges, and also for generators who are looking to access firming, noting there's also the PPAs initiative that's part of the task force package, and that once that certainty's in place, our expectation would be that the handbrake's off and that we should see more of those innovations. We should see generators find it easier to sign up to PPAs. So we'd want to be seeing that occurring or understanding why it's not occurring. So those are some of the indicators we'd be looking to. I can't give you a how long is a piece of string in terms of here's a date. I think we would be wanting to have some quite specific milestones in place for saying we'll relook at it formally here, as well as we'll be monitoring as time goes by. And like I say, once there's certainty, if you talk about retail competition, once there's certainty in relation to hedge availability and even-handedness, you would expect to see that innovation pretty quickly afterwards.
Thanks, Rob. We have a question from Gladys. She says, New Zealand has 29 energy distribution companies. Is that economical or efficient? How can innovative players enter the retail market with existing competition is already stagnant?
So this is as I understand it, the age-old question about the number of regional distributors in New Zealand. I'm not going to be political about that because it's been asked a lot and people will continue to consider it. What I think is really important, rather than the number of distributors, is that the way in which retailers are able to interface with distributors and aggregators and anyone else wanting to interface with them is as standardized as possible, and that we have as much common practice as possible, so that regardless of who, as someone trying to innovate, you're interacting with, you should be having a relatively uniform experience. You shouldn't be having to run 29 different sets of processes that are all really bespoke and add a huge amount of cost and grit in there. So that's where we're focused at, knowing that the question of whether or not there are 29 distributors or less, that's not really within the authorities or the Commission's remit.
Thanks, Rob. We have a question from Nick Haynes. Which entity will be making the final decision? Will it be the authority, the task force, ComCom, the minister?
Cool. So in terms of the task force, Nick, all of the initiatives that we put forward were intended to be things that were within the existing powers of the regulators, as opposed to something that would require legislation, a really fundamental change. And you'll all be aware that at the same time as we're doing this work, the government has its review of the sector going on that's being led by Frontier, and to the extent there are those bigger changes that the government thinks should be made, that's where they sit. So this is all within the task force. All of the initiatives we've put forward, if you were going to regulate them, would be regulated through the code. So the ultimate decision maker is the Electricity Authority, but the purpose of the task force has been for all three agencies to work together and to make sure that we're testing things really hard between the agencies, acknowledging that we all bring a slightly different skill set and different experience. And so my expectation is that anything that was taken forward and ultimately put into the code at a high policy level, all three agencies are agreed on that anyway and have tested that between them. So there's not a difference. It says if the Commission was making this decision, it would be different than if the authority was making the decision. And to date, that's been a really valuable process, and I'm happy for Nathan to speak to it if that's useful. But essentially, as the person who's been trying to drive the work, I've found the testing from all three agencies to be really valuable, and we've reached some really good landings.
Thanks, Rob. Ross Newman asks, can we talk about market transparency? Perfect information is a necessary condition for perfect competition. It feels like that can only be achieved in step 3.
I think I'll start. All of the sort of the guiding documents for us in the legislation, they're aiming at workable competition, not perfect competition. I think that's important. Perfect competition is a really high standard that almost is not achieved in any market, but workable competition matters, and there's been lots of academic discussion on that and court judgments and things like that. But workable competition absolutely still requires information. You'll see that if you look in Appendix B to the paper and the draft principles we've outlined, we've also outlined specific disclosure requirements, and some of those will be disclosure to the authority, but a bunch of that is disclosure externally, publicly as well. And we absolutely agree for this to work, there has to be good information. Part of the value of the Standardised Flexibility Product Initiative with the Super Peak hedge is that what we're trying to do is aggregate the information together to ensure that there's a forward curve for shape rather than just a forward curve for baseload, which comes off the ASX. And stakeholders have been very clear to us that that forward curve for shape is hugely valuable because it helps them understand what the value of that flexibility might be. And for example, what the kind of the value of a battery would be that they could invest in themselves, as opposed to what it would cost to get a hedge. So that transparency is super important. We're really interested in people's views as to what further disclosure would be needed and what we could do quickly on that. You're absolutely right. There will be more information, or it will be more transparent what was going on if we went to step 3. At this point in time, we're not of a view that we would have to go there, and that we think we can overcome some of those information barriers with less deep solutions.
Thanks, Rob. We've got some hands up with people who'd like to ask their questions. Alan, would you like to come off mute and ask Rob your question?
Yep, thank you, Lisa. Alan Eyes, New Zealand Steel here, Rob. Thank you Alan. And the team for the paper. I think it gives us all an opportunity to look at this broadly and comment. My question is around option 2 and in particular step 1. So it does sort of follow on from the immediate prior question. And so my question is, how does the team see this working on a day-to-day basis? That is, that we don't have a trading platform, with particular questions around the communication that we would expect for the gentailers, that is both inter and intra communication between the generation and retail arm, between the buyers and sellers, and coupled with that is this contracted versus uncontracted volume, which gets some exposure in the paper. And how does the authority plan to go about monitoring all of this?
A great multi-part question, Alan, that I will try and respond to, and you tell me what I've missed. So we certainly, while we're obviously at the headline level really interested in ultimately volume, liquidity, price, we understand that process really matters, and all our experience from other sectors and other jurisdictions is that getting that entry process right and ensuring when Alan's organisation or Nick Haynes' organisation seeks a hedge, they're really clear on what the process is, what they can expect in response, when they can expect that response, and how their information will be treated. So step 1 will definitely be very focused on that, making sure that to the extent the process has been inevitably more bespoke because shaped hedges have been traded over the counter, that there is a clearer process in and there is clarity about what you can expect back. There's also obviously going to be disclosure requirements if this option goes ahead in relation to the gentailers' internal transfer prices. Now, there may be some commercial sensitivity around them that we'll have to cross that bridge when we see it, but the aim is that there'll be more information and more availability for everyone to draw appropriate comparisons, but particularly for the authority as the regulator to look closely at that. The principles also are very clear around the need to protect information, both in terms of we can't have a situation where, say, Nick's organisation is seeking hedges that will help it compete with Gentailer X Retail, and when it seeks those hedges, its information goes straight to Gentailer X Retail and it gets that competitive advantage. So there's that protection there. And at the same time, there's also the principle about saying that any kind of commercial information that Gentailer X Generation has, it can't give that to its own retail arm in preference to giving it to external parties that might be seeking hedges. So there's some obligations around information that are really, really important to this to make sure the system is properly leveled up, as opposed to you level up on price, but there's still a whole bunch of non-price factors that allow the gentailer internal arm to get some form of advantage to tilt the playing field. Finally, Alan, I think a really important point of step 1 is there is a proposal for a very clear obligation on gentailer directors to satisfy themselves and sign off periodically that the organisation is meeting all of those non-discrimination requirements, and that they need to make due inquiry on this. It's not a blind kind of it looks okay to us. You actually need to be properly satisfied, and ideally there are consequences if you don't do that process properly. Our experience to date has said that that's not a full substitute, of course, for the regulator monitoring, and we absolutely acknowledge the regulator will need to monitor particularly step 1 closely because there is discretion involved in step 1. But experience says that's a really effective way of creating the right internal incentives within the gentailers to ensure that they actually are meeting these obligations and that they have good processes in place so they can demonstrate to their own directors that they're following the process, as well as demonstrating to the regulator. Ellen, is there something I've missed in there that you want me to go to straight away?
I think, Rob, if you can just comment a bit around the volumes, the contracted versus the uncommitted volumes, and what obligations there may be there, particularly also when one looks out to the future and perhaps uncertainty of availability of kit, all those sorts of things.
Yeah, no, that's great. So we've been clear within the paper that part of the issue we have at the moment is that there is not an infinite supply of flexible generation to back these hedges, and that not only is there limits in terms of just plant capacity, but then there's also issues around dry years and fuel availability. So the paper is seeking to, in the proposal, acknowledge that scarcity can be an issue at times. What we're saying is we expect the gentailers, likely as they currently do, to keep looking to contract forward capacity through hedges. We expect that those hedges are entered into on an even-handed basis, so that they're not able to prioritise hedge volume for their internal business units first and then just give external parties essentially whatever's left over. What that means in practice, though, is that any given time, gentailers will have essentially committed hedge volume, and by firming up their internal transfer pricing arrangements, we want to be clearer as to what those internal commitments are and also what those external commitments are, so that then they have a kind of a clarity of this is contracted. We have an obligation to do this thing for these periods. Then at any given time, there should be uncontracted volume, and obviously as it goes forward, more and more uncontracted volume turns up because hedges roll off. And for that uncontracted volume, essentially what's in the cupboard, that then needs to be dealt with on an even-handed basis, and we need to make sure that from a, for a temporal perspective, in any given period, the requests from internal party X for hedges and the requests from external party X are treated on an appropriate even-handed basis, and we'd be wanting to get really solid process assurance in relation to that. And I think that would be a key thing we'd be expecting gentailer directors to be taking a very close look at as well. But it does acknowledge that there may be points in time where the cupboard is bare. There are not hedges to be sold because there is, from the gentailer's appropriate perspective, nothing left to sell in a period in the future. And so long as that is the same message being given to their internal business unit as being given to their external business unit, that would be the answer. And that's where we acknowledge that everyone needs to have incentives to invest in more flexibility, because right now there's a whole bunch more intermittent generation coming on, and that needs to be backed by something. And there's not a whole build program of huge amounts of mainframe hydro that's going to come and back that. So there is a need for everyone to be looking at what that flexibility looks like, which includes demand response, includes virtual power plants, includes batteries, includes potential forms of generation. Anything is on the table.
Thanks, Rob. We've had Rob Allen with his hand up for quite some time, so I'm wondering if we could ask Rob to come off mute and ask his question.
Oh, hi, thanks for that. And thanks for your response to my earlier question, which wasn't necessarily a straightforward one, and I wouldn't necessarily expect you to have a definitive answer here and now. It's a kind of work in progress type thing to think about. But just following on from that question, and I was reading the consultation paper on the 2A and 2B initiatives. It said that, it suggested that the 2A and 2B retailer regulation would be needed for 5 years to, quote, allow time for the authorities' other work programs to help new generators and independent retailers better compete in the market, unquote. And that worried me a little bit, because I interpret that as meaning that the Electricity Authority considers that it's going to take 5 years for retail competition to work properly in a way that you don't need to do things like regulate retailers' tariffs. That seems like a very, very long period of time to get retail competition working properly.
Yeah, I don't think that's the intended impression that we wanted to create, Rob. And I appreciate you asking the question. Someone asked me a question yesterday about one sentence in the 1D paper that also was not the impression we intended to create. So really happy to keep answering these things. A point was much more along the lines, Rob, of we acknowledge that retail it should be competitive. We want people to be out there doing as much as they can to innovate and to find their competitive position and to not be putting regulatory straitjackets on them. And to be clear, we think that 2B and 2C, they are at the minor end of regulatory controls in terms of they're saying you need to do this, but there's still a bunch of flexibility, and we think there's still a huge amount of space to innovate in there. But our proposition is to acknowledge that as much as possible you set retailers free, and if you do intervene and regulate, you want to think about taking that regulation off at some point in time if you're satisfied that things are working well, as opposed to the risk that sometimes happens with regulation of just put it in place and it's there forever, and all of a sudden people just get used to the regulatory rules and they're kind of part of the landscape that's, for want of a better word, permanently distortionary. And so what the 5-year period was much more about was saying, if we think we should regulate retail now, if we can then commit to saying in a period of time we'll think about removing that, we think that's overall positive for retail competition. It's not saying we think this is going to take 5 years to work. It's more like about a sunset.
Okay, because my starting proposition, maybe that's why I asked the question the way I did or interpreted things the way I did, was that if you had a fully competitive retail market now, then there would be no need to do things like regulate retail tariffs. And from that consultation paper, it's quite clear when you look at the problem definition, it's all about lack of competition. There's not sufficient switching. So someone else might be offering a time of use tariff, but that's not helpful because people aren't going to switch to it because they don't switch. So it seemed very much that that proposal wouldn't be there if competition is working the way it should.
I think that's right. I think it's hard to contemplate that you would regulate something to do with retail pricing plans if you didn't have some concerns about there being some gum or some grit or something that's preventing what would ideally happen in retail, which should be like any other retail market. People just have options and they go and do what they want, and the last thing you want is regulator intervening. So that's unusual for the authority to seek to regulate in the way we have with the task force here, and it's very deliberate and we've thought through it. We're open to the feedback in terms of people's views as to whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, but to some extent we kind of see the evidence. We look at the number of New Zealand consumers who have an option currently of time of use with their current provider, and the percentage doesn't look that good to us. And we say, well, we can just say, let's keep doing the same thing and just relying on switching and see what that looks like. Or we can say this quite targeted intervention of saying, hey, if you're a retailer above a certain size, given the benefits of time of use, we think you should at least have time of use on your books and you should have to tell your customers about that. That feels like a useful but relatively surgical intervention that shouldn't have too many distortionary impacts. That's the theory.
Thanks, Rob. We're going to go back to some questions coming through the Q&A now. That's in order. We have Daniel Crawford. He's asking, in addition to hedge products availability, have you considered credit and how could that be applied under these principles?
So I assume this is credit, prudential, that broader issue. We are thinking about what prudential looks like, bearing in mind that there are good reasons for having it. So in the first instance, you'll see in the, again, Appendix B of the Level Playing Field paper that there is some guidance in terms of prudential sitting in there and what might be expected. Fair to say it's an active topic of conversation that people talk to us about a lot, and we have sympathy for all perspectives around the table. Whether that means there needs to be some kind of material change at the moment, we don't have an answer on that, but it's absolutely understandable that particularly when you're talking about some quite large numbers for hedges, people want to be sure that they can be paid. Similarly, you can't have prudential becoming an inefficient barrier to competition. All of a sudden, it essentially means that innovators can't get into the market because there's this massive financial hurdle. So very open. If you've got some thoughts on it, please reach out. Love to hear from you, because we certainly understand the issue.
Thanks, Rob. Gladys has asked a number of questions, but let's tackle this one if that's in order. A lot of infrastructure investment requires the entire sector to work together instead of competing against each other. We are only a market of 5 million people. How do we effectively consolidate all our limited resources, human resources, talent skills, money resources, investments and technology resources as a sector, and consider all of these as New Zealand's national assets rather than private company equity?
I don't know where to start on that question. It's a I think there's a couple of answers to it. I mean, the first is I agree it's really important for the sector, presumably through the regulator, potentially through the government, to have a really good perspective of outcomes. And are we actually achieving the right collective outcomes? And if we're not achieving those outcomes, what can we do to help make sure that we are getting people together to have those conversations? And there is, notwithstanding there's lots of competition, there is a bunch of collaboration within the sector as well. I don't want to damn that with faint praise. There's some great stuff that you see and hear about. There's always a question of more. Some of that is people talk about a national energy strategy and whether that's the way to do it and what that looks like. I think, again, the government's work at the moment, where it's asking Frontier to give it advice, that will be an interesting place that comes back and says, is there more we need to do at a collective higher level? But to be clear, the model, at least for the wholesale and retail parts of the market, the model is a market-based model that assumes, based on a lot of literature and a lot of study over, I would say, centuries, not just decades, that a market will be a really good way of determining where best to invest, where best to put money, where best to put capital, and that generally achieves better outcomes for lower price than a centrally decided, let's all get together and kind of plan this at a government level. And our job is to make sure that market's working properly, and we acknowledge that you can't just leave markets to themselves. They need to be scaffolded. They need rules around them to make sure that they are working. And what you've seen from the task force is a really significant bunch of scaffolding. I'll just talk for one more minute, then Gladys, I'll come back to you because you've got your hand up. Really interested to hear what you've got to say. Part of processes like we're running now, this level playing field paper consultation, it is a chance for people to talk as well and to collaborate and say, this is actually the big problem. Can we be clear what that problem is and what we might do? So just a quick pitch. We'll be coming out to you all tomorrow on the authority's website, and then through next week's market brief. We are going to have some in-person events to discuss this level playing field measures paper to encourage a bit more dialogue than you get on these webinars, chance for people to really talk about the key issues. They'll be in Auckland, Wellington and Christchurch in the week of the 24th of March. And we'd really encourage people with both specific interest in the proposal, or want to understand how Principle X might work, what does that look like, but also with bigger questions saying, how does this fit? Please do come to those events, because those are going to be the best opportunity to have to and fro about them and to really kind of talk through some of these issues, which, try as you might, it's just a lot harder to make that work on a webinar. Gladys, please follow up.
Thank you. Sorry for asking too many questions.
No, it's great you're asking questions. Please don't apologize.
No, people see me as a question girl at the Energy Summer School. So hello, everyone. Sorry, I'm not representing my company. I'm representing myself. I'm an immigrant to New Zealand. I'm just observing how New Zealand is functioning. I'm from China. I studied in the US and I came to New Zealand, immigrated here anyway. So question for Rob. Thank you for, again, answering my question. So I have seen how things work at Three Waters. We all agree in New Zealand, the flood was happening, the water infrastructure was underinvested. Everyone was agreeing that we need more money, we need people, we don't need technology. So similar things is happening in our current energy transition market. So you did mention that a market-driven approach is really important, and with a lot of analysis and papers supporting that. I guess as an immigrant, I don't know what happened in the history, because I think I learned from someone recently that maybe in 1980s, back in the days, it was actually owned by the nation rather than owned by individual companies. And also the same thing that people are questioning the government over and over again is like they don't want it to be privatized. They want it to be for everybody. So how do we actually balance the both worlds, that we want to be market driven, but in the same time focus on people? Because at the end of the day, we don't want our children to drink contaminated water, and we don't want everybody to live in molded house and unlivable house that contribute to housing crisis, mental health crisis, and health crisis. So yes, I'm just curious. What's your thought about that? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll give you a quick response on that. I am conscious that I could easily fill the rest of the time of the Q&A. Just for what it's worth, Gladys, I love the fact that you bring an international perspective to this. I think it's really important. For what it's worth, I'm actually based overseas as well and live in a country that has non-potable water where I can't drink water out of the tap as well. So I understand what's at stake here. And I've also done work on 3 waters. So again, I understand there's a massive amount at stake. It's never market for market's sake, right? The point of market is that we believe with good grounds that you will get better outcomes for consumers based on market. So it's all still about the long-term benefit of consumers. People have heard me on these calls, you'll get bored. I keep talking about what's in it for my mum.
Sorry, Rob, you got cut out. Oh no.
He'll be back, don't worry.
Okay, you'll be back.
Definitely.
That's a very good ending. Sorry, Rob. So last word I heard was your mom.
Lisa, can you hear? Oh, I was just going to say, look, my mum's just a representative consumer who wants to know that she's got affordable power and that she's the power's going to stay on. She doesn't want to engage with the wholesale market. She's not interested in that. So
exactly,
our job is to steward that through and make sure we get the best possible long-term outcome for consumers, which you'll see. This level playing field paper is absolutely anchored back in if this doesn't produce more choice and downwards pressure on prices for consumers, what are we doing? What's the point in it? I think the question you're asking though is, what's kind of the role of central government intervention? What's the role of even a national champion or things like that, as opposed to private company assets? And again, that kind of national champion approach, that's very much an evidence where I live at the moment. I don't want to kick for touch completely and say that the Frontier Review is the answer to that. We need to be looking at that as well, acknowledging that the GPS that came out last year was crystal clear that the government also supports a market-based structure. I think it's where that scaffolding comes in, and where we acknowledge that the market as it's currently designed, energy only, no capacity, it is supporting a particular approach to generation build. To some extent, it very much supports a just-in-time approach. And the question is constantly asked in the sector, in the transition we're in, with the expected increase in demand, do you want to build a bit ahead of time? And if so, how would you do that when that's not the natural settings of our energy-only wholesale market at the moment? And so the previous government had a view that Onslow might be an answer on that for particular problems. I think it's really timely for us to be running everything we can right now as to what's a good in-market solution, and for the government to be running what's a potential out-of-market solution, acknowledging that if the out-of-market solution distorts the in-market too much, that's a problem. And my kind of final point on that is, on one hand, we have a lot to be thankful for government build, in terms of it was the government with taxpayer money that built all the big hydro dams, that built Huntly, that built a whole bunch of things that we all rely on and make a huge difference to the market. On the other hand, you go back into the history of them and the level of cost overruns and the massive impost on the taxpayer. And I don't think there's anyone in the sector who knows about this who would say that it was an economical way to do things, or that the old Electric Corp kind of centrally owned days were the best use of people's money. There was a massive cost to that. So it's a question of how do we keep costs down, but like you say, make sure we're doing all the right things so our kids end up with a really reliable system with the electricity equivalent of clean drinking water.
Yeah.
I'm really keen to chat again, though, Gladys. I might reach out to you. I think we could have.
Yeah, we will. We need to talk. I'm I'm very frustrated as an immigrant. Just saying,
Thanks.
why? It's okay.
Thanks,
Okay,
Glenys. Those are just awesome questions, and we've made a note to see how we can follow up on all of the questions that you've asked, Rob. I'm just wondering if anybody else on the call would like to ask a question. We have a couple of minutes left. It'd be great to field anything that's on the top of your mind or anything that you have thought about in the last a couple of minutes.
We don't have any other questions. Let's call time on it there, acknowledging that really appreciate people's attendance today and appreciate that people have had a bunch of questions and are still digesting the paper. Like I said, if you can, I'd really encourage you to turn up to the in-person events that will be advertising on our website tomorrow. I think that's a really good forum for conversation. Our Chief Executive has been crystal clear on this. We are open for business over the next 6 weeks. If you have any questions, reach out and we will make time to talk to you. We are absolutely keen not only to make sure you're all fully informed when you get the opportunity to make a submission, which of course we always want, but particularly this one's really important, but also that we're hearing your perspectives during time and we're starting to help us to keep testing and evolving our thinking as opposed to we're waiting in glorious isolation until the 23rd of April. So very, very keen for the conversation to keep going. There's 2 hands up. Gladys, you're up again.
Sorry, just want to know where is that event information?
It's going to be on our website tomorrow.
Oh, tomorrow. Okay, gotcha. And then is it in person or virtual as well?
There's in-person events in Auckland, Wellington, and Christchurch in the week of the 24th. Like I say, we're also still super happy to have online meetings and talk as well. My perspective, having done these in-person events, and Alan and I can probably talk to this in relation to a very different regulatory topic, TPM. It was really valuable to get out and talk to people and have those conversations where you could have some flow between you. There was a lot. The testing was really, really important in that scenario, so we want to do that again.
Lovely. Thank you so much.
Thumbs up from Alan.
So you've got another question from Piers?
Piers.
Yeah, hi.
Piers, I can't quite hear you. Can you speak into the microphone?
Yeah.
You there? Sorry, Piers, we can't seem to hear you
at the moment.
Maybe we move to Alan and come back to Piers. Alan, did you want to ask a further question?
I think he just put his thumbs up to agree with me.
Yes, I was agreeing, Rob. We had some very good debates on that particular topic.
Yeah, and look, we much as those debates are they're confronting and challenging. I really appreciate that at each of the events we had for TPM, there was someone in the room who gave us a really professional hard time, and that's completely appropriate and that's helpful.
Thanks, Alan. Piers, we wondered if you might try again. That sound is just not working.
We're going to get there, Lisa.
All right.
Let's engage with Piers direct, and like we said, this the video of this meeting will be posted on our internet site. Any written questions, when we answer them, we'll also post them as well. Again, we want to be really transparent and make sure everyone's got the same information. We're generally looking to update that Q&A every week. Hey, thank you, everyone. Appreciate your time, appreciate the questions, and we will continue to talk about this. Really looking forward to hearing your feedback. It's a significant thing we're proposing. Like I said, we are steadfast in the view that we need to improve hedge outcomes, but we are clear that we are open for business in terms of all your feedback as to how best to do that. So I'll just finish this with a karakia, and then we'll let you go about your Thursday afternoon businesses. Kia whakaaria te tapu, kia watea ai te ara, kia taruki whakataha ai, kia taruki whakataha ai, haumie, hui e, taiki e.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Thank
Rob
you,
and Lisa.
everyone.
Amazing. Talk
Appreciate
soon.
your time.
Bye.